No.
I sent it to Pat, but he didn't respond. So he's not.
Did you send it to him? Can you send him?
I think it could be the wrong.
Or gas prices.
Or gas prices.
All right, I think we're at the hour here. So we're gonna call, we have two bodies present, obviously. We're gonna call city council to order, conduct that business, and then adjourn, and then leave utilities to do their business. So I'll call today's special meeting, which is the 31st of May, for the Waukesha City Council to order, and we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the Republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I don't know if we do that, but it feels appropriate to check memorial. I'm gonna add just one thing to the agenda for our council piece, and that is just introductions. We have, some of you may have met our new city administrator and some may have not. And then we also have both planning and engineering staff here. So maybe it's okay if we start with you, Brian, since you're at the podium.
Sure.
Introduce who you are.
Sure. I'm Brian Malm. I'm the designated city engineer with Bolton for Waukesha. Wastewater.
Super. Thank you guys for being here. Dean, can we start with you?
Yeah, being city council. John Fry.
Tim Ulrich, city council.
Mike Muller.
And utilities.
Greg Falk, city council.
Emily, you're on city council.
Brian Woodley, city council. And utilities.
Jeff Stellar, city council.
John Friedmeier, city council.
Jessica Lenhart, deputy clerk.
Caroline Gregerson, city administrator.
So we've known Brian a long time. We're getting to know Katie. Jake, thanks for being here. So we have one item of general business. That's our presentation and public hearing on the wastewater and water system reports to the city of Waukesha. And Brian will take us through that.
Thank you, Mayor. Council members, utility commission. We're going to give a presentation, just a brief presentation on these two reports. So there are two formal reports that were done. There's a wastewater facility plan, which is a very large document. And I think copies were provided. Is that right, Caroline? To you for review if you'd like to look at them. Facility plan is a very long document, lengthy document required by the PCA. If you would like to, for cities who are wish to access the funding programs that are available, we'll talk about it in the presentation. The water side report is in the form of a project priority list application. It's a little bit of a shorter report, but again, it gives a summary of the water system we need. So I'm going to go through the presentation here. Jake's going to talk on a few slides, and I'll go through a few slides as well, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. So the overview of the presentation, we're first going to talk about the wastewater system. We're going to talk about really system needs, not necessarily project needs, but we've looked at the entire system and identified what are your infrastructure needs on the wastewater side. And so we'll talk about that. Then we'll go through a summary of alternatives to address those needs. What could you do for improvements to address the needs that we've identified in the system? Then we'll talk about recommendations. Then we'll do the same thing on the water side. And look at the condition of the system, what your needs are, recommended improvements and recommendations for implementing them. Then we'll talk a little bit about funding. How can you fund infrastructure projects like this in the state of Minnesota? What are some of your options? And really, I should back up. The reason we did these reports is specifically related to funding. So the downtown infrastructure project, very large project, significant costs attributable to both the water system and the sewer system. There are funding programs that we'll talk about that are available to provide low interest loan funding, which is advantageous for you and based on your capital financial plan and your financial advisor's recommendation. He is recommending that you pursue low interest loan funding through the Public Facilities Authority program to fund the debt service for that project for the water and the sewer side. So in order to do that, in order to access those low interest loan programs, we needed to go through a process that is set up for those programs. And the start of that process is developing this facility plan on the wastewater side and this PPL application on the water side. So that's why we did the reports, is specifically to set the city up to access funding in the form of low interest loans but also for that specific project, but also to set you up in the future for potential other projects you could fund with low interest loans and potentially grant funding for some of these projects. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works. So that'll be in the funding section, and then we'll talk about schedule a little bit, mostly related to the funding, not related to the project, and then we'll answer questions. I'm going to turn it over to Jake, and he's going to talk about the wastewater.
Yeah, I'm a wastewater engineer at Fulton, Maine, so I help write facility planning reports, specifically the wastewater portion of it. Typically, when we're looking at the wastewater system upgrades at the treatment plant, you're looking at 20 to 25 year useful life before rehabilitation at a minimum is needed. Sometimes I like to compare that to your own home. After 20 to 25 years, you're looking at replacement of your water heater, your boiler, mechanical electrical system. So wastewater is the same type of scenario, except there's just more of the orders of magnitude of more equipment at these facilities. So instead of thousands of dollars, you're looking at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of equipment that needs to be replaced. So your plant currently is 20 years old. It was last rehabilitated and expanded in 2002. So that's what we're looking at for one of the alternatives, is replacing that outdated process equipment, HVAC, plumbing equipment, those types of things. The other driving force with wastewater upgrades is on the regulatory side. So sometimes the BCA or the regulatory agencies tell you, hey, we need to limit, and therefore that would drive improvements. In this case, Department of Agriculture has restrictions on reed beds now. So you have some reed beds there that store long-term your biosolids and help dewater it and bring it back to the facility. So those are now considered invasive reeds that you have out there. So the operators cannot or no longer haul and land apply those reeds. They don't use them more. So what needs to be done to convert those over to a more conventional sand grind bed. The things we looked at in town were the lift stations. We have 4 lift stations, 3 of which we are recommending replacement at this point. The last major improvements to those lift stations is mid-90s, and those were rehab projects, so they're built well before that. So you're at the point where you need to replace 3 out of the 4 lift stations. And then lastly, aging collection system infrastructure. So you have roughly 25 miles of sewer pipe that's buried below the streets in town, of which almost 50% is clay pipe that's susceptible to leaking, root damage, and deterioration over time, and needs clear water entry into the system. So Brian will talk a little bit more about that later and how that might get phased over time with collection system and street projects. So that's part of some of the capacity issues that you've seen at the plant. So on an average basis, the plant is able to handle flows that come into the plant, but there are peak flows. When the river comes up or when there's storm events, you get excessive inflow coming into the wastewater plant, and sometimes the operators have to bypass that at the main lift station, so they can't handle it. In order to avoid backups in people's homes, you got to go somewhere with the wastewater. So it doesn't always all get out to the wastewater plant because of some of these capacity issues. And the last thing I want to look at when doing wastewater improvements and plant for improvements is future considerations. We want to have as much of a crystal ball as we can to look at, okay, what kind of future limits, what might we need to treat for. So in this case, you already have phosphorus limit. That's a pretty common one that's come out in the last 10 to 15 years. And with the PCA's nutrient reduction strategy, they're implementing over the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of facilities are now getting nitrogen. The last few years, you were reissued a permit, and now you have nitrogen monitoring. So the operators out there have to monitor for nitrogen, but you don't currently have to remove it. Typically, when you get monitoring, that often converts over time into a limit. So their PCA at this point is kind of gathering data in order to evaluate whether or not we need a limit in the future. So we wanted to at least look at improvements that would address that. A couple of pictures that I think are just indicative of the condition of the plant and where things are at with equipment. The first picture off to the left is the influent screening equipment. So where all the sticks and rags and whatever else gets flushed down the toilet gets caught in that piece of equipment. So you can see corrosion to some of the motors and components. So that's a piece of equipment that needs to be either repaired or replaced. The picture to the right is of one of the grit pumps. So you have dozens of pumps at this plant. This is just one of them. You can see similar issues, corrosion, wearable components have to get replaced over time. So you're looking at replacing a lot of pumping equipment at the plant. So just in general, we had two treatment alternatives that we considered in the facility plan. The first one was just rehabilitating the existing plant as it sits. So that includes replacing those outdated systems, conversion of the reed beds to a more conventional sand drying bed. So you don't have that invasive reed growing in there that you can no longer land apply. And then rehabbing the existing buildings, things like replacing roofing, doors, hardware, windows, those types of things to the existing buildings. So this alternative basically touches every inch of the plant, but does not build any new infrastructure. There's no new tanks, no new process equipment out for the rest tank. Alternative two is everything in alternative number one. So we're still rehabilitating all the plants, but we look at additional infrastructure for nitrogen. So that's a couple extra concrete tanks, some more pumps, some extra piping, valves, controls, that type of thing. So it's just an added cost of the needs that you have at the plant. And lastly, we always ask ourselves, can we do nothing? In this case, when you're at the 20-year stage, you're kind of looking at some imminent needs that have to be addressed. There's really no option to not do anything. Because what you see over time is that these wastewater plants become more expensive to operate as things break down, and you see it a lot. They're actually seeing it in Lanesboro right now, another plant that I'm working on where their existing plant is starting to break down right as we're trying to construct and get the new plant started up. So within a couple of months, they're doing emergency repairs to clarify equipment and things like that. So those things do pop up at the time if you don't try to proactively address some of the stuff. So what was recommended in the facility plan was alternative number one, rehabilitating the existing facility. So you can see in the table there off to the right, the bottom line there is just over $6 million in the range of 5.9 to 6.5 million. That's in today's dollars. So some of the bigger line items from the table, the process equipment replacements, they're just under $2 million. There's just a lot of equipment out there that needs to get updated. Converting over to sand drying beds is a pretty big dollar item to get rid of that material, having to landfill all the material that's in the existing beds, and then bring in new stuff and build them back up. And then the mechanical and piping systems is another bigger line item, but it all adds up to roughly $6.2 million at this point. Extended service life of 20 years if you do all this. So you're again touching every square inch of the plant essentially. So all those equipment and systems are going to be updated and they're going to last for 20 years. Benefit of this alternative is that no land is required. We're not digging any holes anywhere. We're just getting inside the existing buildings, replacing equipment. Alternative number two, adding the nitrogen removal, we estimated about $2.5 to $3 million to build those additional tanks, the pumps, piping, valves, controls. And at this point, we're not recommending that because we do not currently have a permit limit for nitrogen. So until you get that, in my mind, there's really no sense in preemptively building that infrastructure because, like Brian will talk later on, there are grant programs out there that help pay for those items when you come up. You also get typically a compliance schedule for the PCA that you negotiate of 5 to 10 years. So you get the permit limit, then you have another 5 to 10 years to actually meet the permit limit and implement the improvements. So you do have some time. So between the uncertainty of when you get that permit limit and how soon you have to meet it, you could be looking at more like 15 to 20 years.
Please do.
So I'll take back over and talk a little bit about the collection system. So the wastewater treatment plant is just one part of your sewer system, right? We've got to get the water to the wastewater treatment plant. And as Jake mentioned, the majority of your, or a large part of your collection system is still the original clay sewer pipe that was installed originally. It's susceptible to leaking, and you've got inflow issues and essentially infiltration issues due to the river levels and some of those pipes that are below water level. So the goal of addressing the collection system is not only to upgrade the pipes and any structural issues, root issues, and other types of things that are associated with the collection system, but also to take care of that infiltration and inflow, that clear water getting into the system. So when we looked at your collection system, we looked at two different options for doing this. One would be complete replacement of the system, replacing the pipes and the manholes. And And the other option would be a CIPP lining, or like we've done on some of your pipes already. So you've got a significant, not a significant, but a portion of your system that's already been lined, the mains and the services. So we looked at the remaining portions of the collection system that hadn't been addressed, either by lining or replacement, and we applied costs to them. And we looked at what would the cost be if we completely replaced all the pipes and the manholes and the services, versus what would the cost be if we were to line the remainder of the system. And you can see the two different costs there. If we were to do all lining, it's about 10.5 million. If we completely replace everything, it's about 15 million. So how do you decide between these two? Well, you basically have to look at the other elements of your infrastructure. You also have to look at what is your water main system like. It would make a lot of sense to replace, to line the sewer system. You had to dig up the street to replace the water pipe anyway. Because the reason for the cost difference here between the 15 million and the 10 million is in the restoration of the surface. So you dig the pipe up, you've got pavement, and the sidewalk, and curb, some places, and grass that you've also got to address. Well, if the street's in bad condition already, and you need to replace the water pipe, you really can't address water main pipe by lining. You got to dig that up if you're going to replace it. So if you're going to incur the cost of the surface restoration anyway, then you go ahead and replace the pipe instead of lining it. It's more cost effective to do that if you're in a situation where you're going to dig up the street and replace it anyway. But we looked at both options, and there are some portions of your system where you've already lined the main and the services. We wouldn't necessarily need to do anything, but there's also portions of your system where we haven't yet lined the services. And we did include that in here in the replacement option, because it wouldn't make sense to replace that line of pipe. So we talked about the downtown reconstruction project. So how much of this cost is associated with the downtown project? If you remember, we had that $15 million total project cost. And actually, I apologize, these are the wrong numbers here. I meant to have the remaining collection system cost there. That's the total system. But basically, you can see on the left that 2023 reconstruction project, you've got about $2 million worth of that. 15 million is associated with that downtown project. So you're biting off a big chunk of it for the downtown project, but there's still a significant a portion of that cost remaining in the rest of your system. So a large need out there. And this is the location of the downtown reconstruction project. And the pipes within that purple area will be addressed as part of that project. And this map shows the remaining clay sewer pipe that will need to be addressed. And if you look at the legend there, you've got some red areas and some blue areas. The blue pipes are ones that have already lined the main, and all that's remaining to do is address the services. And so in those areas, we probably wouldn't replace the pipe itself. We probably just address the manholes and line the services.
When you say address the services, how far into the private property?
We typically would go out to the right-of-way line, depending on the situation. And the previous projects we lined the services, we went to the right-of-way line because we were trying to get the service risers. The pipe is deep, the services come up to a certain level, and then they go out to the right-of-way. So we've lined the pipe that's below the groundwater level, and we're concerned about. But typically, you stop at the right-of-way line. That would be the same with a lining project or a pipe replacement project. Lift station. We're going to talk about this.
So I think just going back to that previous picture, the orange lines are the ones to be done.
Orange lines haven't been done, right?
No, everything in color needs to be done. Yeah. The blue would be stuff that's already, the mains have already been lined, but the services haven't. And the red is stuff that is clay that would need to be replaced by.
And this is sewer?
Yep.
Because like, I'm on Main Street, I thought that was all lined already.
No.
Okay.
Not on Main Street. The stuff by the river has been lined.
Okay.
But not on Main Street.
Lift station, it says rehabilitation, it's actually replacement. So I mentioned 3 out of the 4 lift stations were recommending replacement. Currently, the downtown lift station along Lawrence Boulevard is kind of the main lift station that pumps all the wastewater plant. It's in a tough location. It's in the old lift station where the operators actually have to physically climb down the tube to get down to the pumps and valves, so it presents kind of a dangerous situation. Just poor accessibility and hard to maintain. So that's one of the lift stations. There's 2 other lift stations, one on 9th Street and one on Newton Avenue, recommending replacements that are just older and to be replaced. So the new lift stations, we propose submersible pumps, new electric controls, new precast manhole structures. Operators would have accessibility from above. You can just pull the pumps out of the wet well structure rather than climbing down the hole to try to get to them. And the controls will be above grade, so they're not actually down on the pit either. So they actually have to flip a switch. They don't have to crawl down there every time. So looking at capital costs, we're at about a little over $2 million on that estimate. It's a range of 1.9 to 2.1 million at the very bottom there. The biggest chunk of that is definitely Lawrence Boulevard lift station, just because it's in a tough location downtown, next to the river. Extra dewatering, extra site work, pavement work to relocate that and rebuild it. So that's the biggest chunk. This is just a summary slide of everything we just talked about for the wastewater side of things before we get into the water stuff. So collection system improvements, Brian talked about phase replacement rehabilitation, the 2023 downtown project has a nice little chunk of that of the total cost of the implementing some flow monitoring and clear water connection inspections to look at where some of the clear water is coming into the system to try to reduce those excessive inflows. Talk about replacement of 3 sanitary lift stations and then the wastewater treatment system improvements, going with the alternative one, rehabilitating the existing facility, addressing all the age-related needs of the plant, but not spending the extra money to preemptively try to meet that nitrogen limit when you could wait for that and maybe get some grant later on. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian. And talk about water.
So what was the total cost of sanitary? Including the wastewater system plan.
So you got about $2 million in the lift station, and then if you go back on the sewer pipe, you got about 15, so you're at 17 million, and then you got about 6 million for the wastewater plant. So 23, 24 million, something like that. So not small numbers, but not atypical numbers for a town your size, given the age of your collection system and the age of your plant and the lift stations and those types of things. Infrastructure is just continues to be almost ridiculously expensive. So we'll talk about the water system now. So we looked at a few things on the water system. You have a pretty simple water system right now compared to other cities. You don't have a filter plant. You don't have centralized water treatment. You basically have 3 wells, a pump. You introduce chlorine and fluoride, pump to the distribution system. You've got a ground storage reservoir up on the hill. And you've got a booster pump that pumps up to the upper area. And you've got a standpipe up there, which is actually a pretty unique standpipe. It's uncoated. Corten steel, not a work of art, but it's functional. It's called functional. I haven't seen one like that. It's kind of unique. I showed it to our coating specialist, and he says the first time he's ever seen an uncoated standpipe. So not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just kind of unique. So on the distribution side, so the piping, the pipe that distributes water to the system, you've got a lot of cast iron water main left in kind of the core part of town. That was originally put in 1913, so it's the original water system. It's a significant age to it, and it's where you should really be looking at replacing that pipe. Cast iron pipe is susceptible to breaks, and as you know, you have a significant number of water main breaks around town, not just on that cast iron pipe, but a lot of service connection issues and other things. So you've also got a significant amount of unaccounted for water, which means that basically the DNR makes you look at, well, how much water you pump out of your wells, okay, and then how much water goes through the meters that you're selling water to people, And there's a difference there. And you have a significant amount of water that you're pumping that's not going through meters that you're selling. And it's likely that the majority of that is leaking into the ground. And uniquely in Wabasha, possibly not even coming to the surface because you've got sandy gravel soils and you've got high groundwater table, and you may not even see it. Unique situation, but one of the things that sort of highlights that is, if you remember back in 2016, we had the water main break on the 12-inch water main that crossed the, I think, well, actually 10-inch. Anyways, the water main that crossed the railroad tracks at Campbell Avenue. We're pretty convinced that thing was broke at least a year before it came to the surface. That water was going somewhere, it just wasn't coming to the surface. A lot of towns, immediately when you get a water main break, it'll come to the surface. That one didn't come to the surface for quite a period of time until the frost got down deep enough where it didn't have another place to go. So it's believable that you could have a lot of leaks in the system that aren't necessarily coming to the surface. The other things we looked at in the Utility Commission, folks know this well. Well number 1, constructed 19. Well number 2, you rehabbed a couple of years ago. Well number 3 is brand new. Well number 1 is the brand new well that just hasn't been rehabbed yet. So we looked at an alternative to rehabbing that well, and then potentially looking at some improvements to that well house as well, the house as well, on well 2. And then lastly, the booster station that pumps water up to on top of the hill of the golf course up there, originally constructed in 1976. It's a beautiful picture here in the lower right-hand corner. It kind of looks like a Bilbo Baggins.
I was gonna say, house.
Lord of the Rings kind of tucked in there. Interesting location. Just hadn't had any significant improvements since it was constructed. The pumps are old, and just recommend replacement of that given its age and condition. We did look at the ground storage reservoir and the standpipe, and as you know, the standpipe had some interior coatings done not that long ago. Really didn't see any major needs with either the ground storage reservoir or the standpipe. And so that is pretty much your entire system. Water meters, we know you're pursuing that separately, replacement, otherwise that would be something we typically look at in your report. So what are the estimated costs we're talking about here? Distribution side, replacing, basically looked at what would the cost be to replace all that cast iron pipe in conjunction with street projects. As I mentioned, lining water main really isn't an option, especially if you've got 4-inch pipe. You can't, 4-inch pipe is undersized for fire protection purposes. You need at least 6. We're putting in 8-inch now because the cost of 8-inch versus 6 is so minor. So you can't line a 4-inch and create an 8-inch out of it. And you also can't do the services trenchless like you can with sewer pipes. So really the only option to replace the water main pipes is to dig them up. So there's really only one option there. You've got about 49,000 feet of remaining pipe in town. You're going to knock off about 3,000 feet of that as a part of the downtown project. About 1.8 million there, and then the remainder of the cost would be about 16 million to get rid of the rest of it. And you really just want to look at that kind of in conjunction with your sewer pipes and your street conditions as you knock off reconstruction projects. And Jake talked about in the previous slide some flow monitoring and sump pump inspections or clear water connections. And we don't have I don't think you have a significant number of sump pumps in town, but really we want to look for if you have any clear water connections in the system. Flow monitoring, how would you target where to do these projects? Maybe look at that flow, do some flow monitoring, try to determine where the significant sources of inflow are coming from, and maybe target those areas of town for replacement first and prioritize that way. Now, we'll take care of these pipes in the purple area, and then this map here in the red shows where the remaining, the best of the information we have available, where that remaining cast iron, 4-inch cast iron pipe is that hasn't already been addressed by other projects like your 2013 project or isn't pipe from newer developments. The other costs, well number 1, rehab. if you were to send it out for a project, just had an estimated costing here of about $180,000. That includes some rehab to the well house itself, not just the well. So if you're comparing that to prior costs for rehabbing well number 2, that didn't include the well house rehab. And then the booster station, it costs to build a new booster station and building right around $1 million. So overall recommendations on the water system: rehab that well number 1, televise and inspect the well to determine what needs to be done, repair, replace the aging components, adding in a water level monitor, which you have on well 2, and on well number 3, so you can monitor aquifer levels. It's a DNR requirement. You're not able to do that on well number 1 right now. And then rehabbing the well house and the booster station, the new building, booster pumps, piping, HVAC, and getting rid of Bilbo's house.
You're not recommending doing the distribution system?
Oh, yes, we are. Yeah, it's didn't title it as recommendations, but you're definitely doing the downtown project, and then that's what's kind of my discussion about how you would tackle the distribution system. What we would really do is recommend is targeting the water main in areas where you're targeting the sewer, and prioritizing those areas based on where you think the inflow is coming from, where all the leakage is coming from, and further targeting it based on street condition. So where are the bad streets? Where's the bad sewer pipe? And then tackling that 4-inch water main together with that.
Are you proposing this to do well number 1 in the booster station right now?
And the downtown project.
And the downtown?
Yep. So I mentioned earlier, at the start of this, that we went on this venture, not only to give you an idea of what the magnitude of your needs are, look at the entire system, what do you need to do if you were to address all the needs in your system at one time, but also because in order to access funding that's available through the Minnesota Public Facilities Authority, you need to do these reports and submit them to the agencies that govern the sanitary sewer and the water, which is the MPCA and the NDH. So what does PFA do for you from a funding standpoint? Well, they have the Clean Water and Drinking Water Revolving Fund programs, which provide low interest loans to cities for infrastructure improvements. The loans are typically 20 to 30 years in length, 30 years only if you have, if you qualify for it. Standard loans, 20 years. Interest rates are in the 1 to 3% range. They've been now at the 1% range. They're probably creeping up now because they do follow the market a little bit. But generally, at least 1 point, if not 2 points lower than what you would get on the open market by selling the bond on your own. Your eligibility for accessing those loans is based on scoring criteria. So you submit your projects that you want to do, and based on what problem you're trying to solve with those projects, they give you a score. And then they rank you on a list with everybody else that's accessing the funding. And then they run down the list until they run out of loan funding to give out, and they draw a line. And if you're above the line, you're eligible to apply for loan funding. If you're below the line, you're ineligible. The IIJA bill, the infrastructure bill, is going to pump a lot of money into these programs. So we're expecting that in the up the ability to fund, likely fund, depending on how many communities apply. In years where the legislature doesn't fund the bonding bill, like they didn't this year, it's a bonding year, they didn't pass a bonding bill yet. Hopefully they'll do that at some point in special session, because these programs rely on supplemental money from the legislature to fund some of these programs, like the Water Infrastructure Fund, which is a grant program funded by the state by a bonding bill. So that's the grant side of this program. People always ask, how do we get grants for infrastructure? Well, this is one of the ways. The good news is there's typically grant money available. The bad news is it's income based, and they calculate your eligibility to access those grants, or your need for the grants, based on a formula. And on the drinking water side, they basically say that your need is based on 1.4% of your median household income. So they look at census data related to your median household They say that you should be able to afford 1.4% of the median household income, multiplied by the number of equivalent residential users that you have in your system. On the clean water side, it's based on 1.2% of the median household income. Did I flip those backwards? Yeah, I got them backwards. Apologies for that. It's 1.2 on the drinking water side, 1.4 on the clean water side.
What's the difference between clean water and drinking water?
Drinking water is your water main, clean water is your wastewater, and incidentally, stormwater. They'll fund some stormwater projects as well through that. Think clean water being the water we discharge to the rivers. Drinking water, obviously, the water you drink. So the water infrastructure fund will provide 8% grant for eligible costs up to $5 million maximum. The other program Jake was talking about when he mentioned the nitrogen limits and waiting on that, there's a program called the Point Source Implementation Grant Program, which funds wastewater only, and it's based on, it's a treatment-based program. So if you were to get a limit for nitrogen that the PCA imposed on you in your permit, you would be able to access the Point Source Implementation Grant Program as a grant funding up to 80% grant, $7 million max. So that's why you would generally want to wait on that until you actually have a limit, because you could potentially access these grant funds to fund that. So when we're talking about the additional $2 to $3 million for nitrogen treatment, 80% of that you could go and battle out on some other projects for grant funding for that. The other program, the USDA Rural Development does have an infrastructure funding program too. They provide longer term loans with income-based interest. Their interest is much higher than PFA, although their loan term is like 40 years. So they knock down your annual payments by giving you a really long loan term. And they're also affordability based for grants, but it's 1.5% median household income.
If we leave now,
Right.
we'll go
Competitiveness.
down and get back up to the set.
Hill water.
Yeah,
What were you
we'll
gonna
see
talk
that here.
about? Okay.
So if we look at what your current user rates are, oops.
It'll be 10 o'clock tonight for all we
Water
know.
sales, the average residential user in town uses about 4,500 gallons of water per month. And at your current rates, that average user would pay about $17 a month on their water bill, which is really low compared to a lot of other cities. So you have some very affordable water in town. On the wastewater side, that equates to about $54 a month for that 4,500 gallon water user. That's mid-range, I would say, not real high.
Losing.
But if we look at that affordability, 1.2% on drinking water, 4% on wastewater, and we do the calculation, your median household income that PFA would use today is about $53,996. We do the math on that. The PFA would say you could afford an average user to pay about $50 to $55 a month on the water system. And on the wastewater system, you could afford $60 to $65 a month.
Who could have? Yeah, maybe they ought to ask the people that pay them.
Yep.
The point is,
They
it's a
don't
grant
ask.
criterion and score back.
They don't ask, they just, this is what they've determined as the criteria. Well, what does that mean? That means that you would need to incur costs on your system, meaning debt service for additional, debt service for doing projects based on your needs. You would need to incur debt such that your system costs equated those numbers before you would be grant eligible. Right. So on the water system side, you can see you've got quite a gap there. You would need to take on a significant amount of debt service and do a significant number of projects before you would ever be eligible for grants on the water side. On the wastewater side, you're not that far away. And given the costs that you're looking at the treatment plant and the collection system, you may be very close to that by taking on the debt service that you would for the projects that you need to do. So you're pretty close. You're getting closer to grant eligibility on the wastewater side. You've got quite a long ways to go on the water side. And it's a little bit worse than it even looks, because Caroline mentioned the ski hill issue. The piece that we're not calculating here is they say, okay, you got $50 to $55 a month on the water system per EDU, per average user. Well, every residential hookup is one EDU. Your commercial water sales altogether, so the volume of water you sell to your commercial users is divided by the average residential user to get a number of EDUs on the commercial side. You sell a significant volume of water to the ski hill, and the ski hill represents a significant number of EDUs. Well, the total number of EDUs is multiplied by that $50 to $55 a month to form the pot of money that they say you can afford to spend on your water system. So the water you sell to the ski hill tells the agency that you can afford a lot more because they represent a significant number of EDUs.
Well, when they say you can afford it, who's paying for it?
Oh, you're paying for it all.
Yeah, we're paying for it.
Yeah. But they decide what's affordable because they're getting off the grant. Fun conversation.
So it's a scoring criteria or an eligibility criteria?
It's both. So you need to be eligible you need to fit the affordability criteria to be eligible for the grant. You still go on the ranking list and they'll, go down the list of projects. Some of them will be eligible for loan only and they'll be running out of loan money as they go down the list. But they'll also have projects that'll pop up. That'll be, oh, these guys are grant eligible. Give them the amount that they're eligible for grant and they're slowly running out of grant money. So they go down the list.
They rely on the bonding years for that, so we're not in a position to expect to apply based on our eligibility and where the bonding currently sits at this moment, but we want to.
Well, for grant funding, you
Yeah.
probably wouldn't qualify for this project anyway, the 2023 project. We are still submitting the IUP applications for you so you can access the low interest loan money, which you may or may not qualify. We'll see where you rank.
Yeah.
Hopefully that wasn't too complicated. That anyways.
Brian, could we apply for grant funds just for the wastewater portion of any project?
Yeah, and what you do is you don't really apply specifically for grant funding. What you do is you submit your project.
Okay,
The application you submit will have all the information they need to determine whether you're grant eligible. If you're grant eligible, you'll get the grant money.
Not a lottery.
Yeah, it's not all that. Yeah. So this is the funding schedule. So we submitted the facility plan and the PPL, or the facility plan on March 4th, and which is also the PPL application on the wastewater side. The water PPL application we submitted on May 6th. We're having the public hearing tonight for the facility plan, which is required by PCA. June 3rd, we're going to submit what's called intended use plan applications for the downtown project, and that'll set that project up for the list for them to determine whether you fall above the line of available money they have and whether you're eligible to get loan funding for that project. So we'll submit that on June 3rd. We'll get preliminary facility plan approval from the NPCA on the wastewater side on June 30th. It's kind of a sidebar. But then the funding list, when will you know if you're eligible for PFA financing for the downtown project? We'll know that in September.
So that's just for the downtown project, it's not for all of this.
It would be for anything we submitted intended use plan projects for. We had not intended to submit intended use plan applications for anything but the downtown project, unless you told us to, but we're kind of going by what's on your capital financial plan. And so, as you know, a lot of those needs are not on your capital finance plan right now. So, but once you get on there's two lists. There's the project priority list, which will have everything that we submit. And then there's the intended use plan. That's what you intend to do the very next year. The other projects stay on the PPL. And in the subsequent year, then we can apply for those. So this will set you up for everything we've identified in those reports to apply for funding in a future year if you didn't do it this year.
What kind of time frame to implement like all of this? Are we looking at $45 million? Is there any kind of a prioritized list out of this plan that says
Do
The
this.
biggest priority is this.
Well, so we looked at your downtown project is obviously one we prioritize because we're tackling that right now. The utility commission, we've talked about well number one, and you have a choice on that. You can choose to just do the rehab itself and just pay cash, or you can go through this program if you want to, you know, right? But the only things
I
you
don't think Carolyn
prioritize,
wants to do it back.
the only things you really prioritize are what's in your capital finance plan. All the other stuff, as you update your capital finance plan, we have to look at how that's doing.
So most of this was unknown at the time of the capital.
Well, specifically, yeah. In general, it was
Do
no.
you see a lot of this as I'm wondering, is this like, that we just didn't keep the system up? I mean, we have a 20-year-old wastewater treatment, but it sounds like it's falling apart.
No, just a couple of situations, just something expensive. I mean, $6 million sounds like a lot. It's in the scope of a new wastewater treatment plant like that cost you. And you'd be looking at probably $20 to $30 million brand new for everything. If you were to build that whole thing. So.
And that gets us 20 years. Do we have a preventative maintenance program out there? I mean, are they doing, like, changing out motors on a regular basis, changing out pumps?
I've been attending utility commission meetings since 2014, and I know you've been replacing pumps and.
Well, it's all that's great, so, yeah.
Yeah. Let me answer your question this way. You're not doing anything that much different than any other city. That helps.
Well, I wonder about these figures. So if our average user is 4,500 gallons, we're paying water and wastewater together about $70 a month. Then we're gonna go to these new rates. Are we gonna, the average user gonna be paying $110 a month?
If you did projects up to your affordability level and accessed grant to help pay for the rest, you might actually go over those if you do this piecemeal, because as you know, it was, as I said, it's only funded 80%. So if you were at your affordability level today and you did a project next year, they'd fund 80% grant for that if they had the money and if you ranked out high enough to access the money. Well, now 20% of that was still over your affordability. And the next time you do a project, again, 80% grant, the next 20% will still be over affordability. So
I guess I'm not following that totally. What I'm wondering about is your figures here on the affordability in 20. Are we going to end up paying $50 to $55 a month for the water system per person?
Not right now.
well, not right now. You would have to decide that if you did.
Well, right
You'd
now,
have to
it's
vote on that.
17. We're gonna go to 50.
That's up to you guys.
Strategic, it's strategic. If we wanted to qualify for these grants for the overall financial plan, we have to choose what we want to do. But according to the grant criteria, we aren't eligible for any monies, even the 80% of it, unless we're at that level. That's their determination of what, but it's our decision whether that's the strategy or not.
I'll give you an example of a smaller town. So Jake mentioned Waynesboro, little town of Waynesboro, 750 people. Several years ago, they had a radium issue in their water system. They had to build a filtration plant on the water side, a radium treatment plant. So they did that. They accessed some PFA funds. They got some grant dollars. They did that project. Their water rates, I think, are in the $60 a month range, something like that. They also had wastewater plant issues. They had the oldest mechanical wastewater treatment plant in the state. They had really done virtually very little over the years. Built a new wastewater treatment plant, and we're doing some pipe replacements. Their wastewater rates per average user are in the $75 a month range. So, $150 a month, water and wastewater combined isn't out of the question for cities that have addressed their needs, gone through the funding programs, got grant money. Now, on the flip side of that, Waynesboro's accessed about close to $9 million in grant funding through this program. Now, they've also had a significant amount of debt, all of those water and sewer rates, but.
And just to answer another question, for our downtown street project, I think we analyzed those rates. I think everyone's rates are going up 2%. So to do the downtown project, because we were retiring old debt, no one's rates are going up significantly to undertake that project. But now that we retired debt, if in the future we take on more debt, that's where, rates would go up even more than what we have planned. So we're doing the downtown project without making anybody pay, with keeping rates about just with the 2% increase.
And you can keep doing that. You can keep waiting for debt service to fall off and then backfilling that debt service with another project debt. But, once you take this on, you're gonna have another, depending on how long we finance that, it's gonna be, typically the shortest period you do a bond for is 10 years. So, you can keep picking off projects every 10 years, but you're not gonna, you talk about 20-year life on wastewater plant improvement, you're not gonna catch up. So it's the same problem every city in the state is dealing with. For the cities that have stopped and looked at their infrastructure and analyzed and determined what the needs are. If there's cities that still have low rates and wonder what the heck you're talking about, it's just because they haven't looked.
So the other financing arm is bonding.
Yep.
Okay. Which then in turn raises the tax levy.
Well, it depends on how you serve the debt.
Right.
You serve it with utility funds, which means raising
Raising,
rates.
yeah, that side, or
You can use tax levy for some of that too.
I think
That's what-
historically we've used utility rates to pay for
utility
utilities.
projects,
Mhm.
yeah.
That's where Mike's fancy spreadsheets come in, where he shows, well, you can do this, you can do that, here's what happens to the graphs. And
Yeah.
that's it. It's all bad news. Sorry.
All right, important to know it, so you'll keep us informed of any new criteria that comes to you or put in regular criteria we need to take into consideration. All right, and then we have last.
Right.
Yeah,
Question.
Tony, go ahead.
Would it be a good idea for the utility board to discuss the ski hill, or how big a difference is that gonna make, or is it something we need to look at, or?
So we could, we have the numbers now, we could tell you what impact that's having on the ERUs and that.
Just overall, what's the issue with that?
Well, you sell them a lot of water at a reduced rate. So the way, when you sell them a lot of water, there are a lot of ERUs that you multiply by that 1.2 times the median household income. So it tells the PFA, the funding agency, sees the ski hill as, well, that's a great revenue source for the city. They can generate a lot of money. You can pay a lot of debt with all that revenue. Well, it's not the case if you're
I wasn't aware of the base rate.
So what we've talked about incidentally is like, well, so you're selling the city water to make snow. Is there a cheaper way to do that? Do you need to sell them city water to make snow? What would it cost to drill a well? What would, just what are the options on the table to do something different to make snow? And there might be some options there. If they're costing you a bunch of money and reduced rates on your system, what would it cost them to drill a well? And what if you funded that instead of funding them the gap in rates, and then you get out from under it someday? Just spitballing, you're right.
Yeah, no, and how long of a lag time would that take to fall into the adjust the grant number? Would it be immediate? I mean, if we put it in this summer and this winter.
Well, as soon as they're not buying water in your system, it's immediate. It's just a question of how that happens. If you're somehow financing that for them by continuing to give them, take whatever the increment is and what you would normally be selling them, and instead of putting that to cheap water for it, put it to financing the well. I don't know. It's just one of the ideas we talked about. Because otherwise it's going to go on forever. And if it's not economically sustainable to charge them, the standard commercial rate to make snow and for them to stay in business, and they're
And for
economic development.
financial assistance.
And they're an economic generator for the city. It's all those things, all the non-engineering stuff that I shouldn't be talking about. So.
But yeah, it seems like it's worth looking at if long-term we're gonna need grant funds, which we will, to get it all funded.
Still not going to change the need to go from $17 to $50 if you want to access grant funding. You just got you've got low water rates in town. And it kind of makes sense when you look at the system. You've got a really old system you haven't done much with. Really, all you've done is you've drilled a well. Recently, anyway.
Any other questions for Brian or Jake?
Well, I just would want to recognize, it feels like a lot of bad news, but we are knocking off some really big projects with the downtown project. And we used our ARPA funds and a combo, I think the utilities actually is ultimately paying for it to replace some computers. And I think we're going to apply for some grant funding for one of the wells, right? Or did?
So yeah, Pat, we applied for this plan implementation grant for a little bit of funding for the well rehab, so $10,000 or something.
And then from my administrator perspective, I think let's just get the 2023 project down, get that financing in, and then maybe we kind of, you know, after we get that project done, then take a look at the list and look at our financing options. But if now's the time to keep applying because there's funds available, it seems like it's good to have this study in place.
After, yeah, you're now in the queue, or you will be in the queue on the funding list. We'll be able to better talk with the agencies about where you fit. We'll be better on the sewer side to see how close you are. You know, okay, you're this far away from affordability. What's the next project you would chunk off? Oh, now you're grant eligible for that. Well, that maybe changes the picture of it for you. So.
And just to get the acronym straight, although I'll forget them by the time we talk about this again, but the project priority list has been submitted. And that's the first step. And then what the intended use, again, you said is anything that would be queued up for the next year.
Yeah.
And is that, then again, is that essentially criteria for them to prioritize you? They know everything you need, now they know what you're planning on doing?
Yeah, the first list is literally just the ranking based on the score, and they have the project cost order. They just say, here's all the projects that apply, here's all they rank.
Yep.
The intended use plan then goes through that list and says, oh, these guys actually submitted a plan to do something next year. Take all of them over here, re-rank them. Now start distributing the money. Oh, we ran out of money here. There's the cutoff.
Then you go back to the list.
Yeah, and then incidentally, if you submit and you miss the cutoff, well, now you're below the cutoff line that you submitted. Next year, you go to the top of the list and get ranked with those projects as carryover. You rank ahead of the projects. So there's an advantage to submitting.
Right.
And resubmitting if you don't get funded, because they'll put you back at the top of the list.
Right. Good to know.
Pat got caught on the bridge, but he's been on the line and he's already received a presentation of this. So I will also touch base with him, but I think Pat felt like it was a reflection of the needs for sure.
Oh yeah, I mean, when we had ARPA monies flow, I think Jeff or I reached out and it took him about 1.6 seconds to respond with about $500,000 of the cost that he left. So I don't know that.
Out of all the stuff in the plan, what do you see as the biggest risk? Or whatever fix?
Well, that's a good question. On the wastewater side,
Because the notion that we can just proceed along and chip away at the stuff year by year, it's all contingent on something not failing.
Right.
And then if it, once it fails, then we're stuck. We gotta do this.
you know, on the wastewater side, I'd say like the plant is obviously a critical piece of infrastructure. The lift stations are critical pieces of infrastructure. Lift stations fail. I mean, if the Bluetooth failed, you got a big problem.
Yeah, I would put the main lift station probably as priority number one, the wastewater
So,
side. I would say within the wastewater plant itself, there's probably a whole area to do multiple projects you can split out. So there's an opportunity to break that up too.
Yeah, that's the other thing. On the way on that 6.5 million, you don't have to do all 6.5 million at once. You can pick off subsets of that to do. So on the water side, again, probably about critical pieces of infrastructure, the booster station, and that's serving a whole area of town. If you can't pump water up to the top of the hill, those people don't have water. Well, number one, you have 2 wells already. That's you don't want to let that well go to waste. It's there, it's functional. You should get it in the rotation. Right now, it's emergency backup because you're worried about it, so you should get it back in the rotation. The pipes are, I mean, they've been there since 1913. You know, I mean, there's a point where it gets ridiculous, they leave in the ground, but is the whole west side of town gonna fall apart in the next 5 years? Well, it's been there since 1913, so you should probably replace those pipes sometime. Well, they're well past the.
But nice work whoever took care of that 1913 project.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think the plastic pipe we're putting in the ground now will last some projects that'll last that long. So, I mean,
Super. Any other questions or comments? We have a resolution for us as council that we can adopt this wastewater treatment facility plan. And if we see a motion for that, and then second, we can have discussion and welcome any comments from utilities.
Where, do we need to open a public?
Yes, we do, actually. We have a public hearing. So it's exactly 5 o'clock. I think we'll open the public hearing. We've heard from some of our staff, we have the members of the public. Is anybody online, Carol?
Just Pat and Tyler, staff is online, and
Do
this
they
is,
care to make any comment? Does Pat care to make
Pat,
any
do you
comment?
care to make a comment? I guess not.
Okay. I mean, members of the public utilities commission can certainly make a public comment too, obviously. Any public comment? The minutes go so slow during these periods where we have no public. 20, anything? 20 minutes, fill the silence.
Just a little, kind of quick, been working with Pat for quite a few years, and we share our crew back and forth working on stuff, and I know, like, your question about, you know, have we been leaving stuff going? We haven't, but, you know, we only have, we can only work within our budget. So it's basically small stuff. This stuff is like long-term, you know, looking into the future, and yeah, it's gonna add up, but rather know now than 10, 20 years when it's even worse. So I know the plant, you know, the plant is operating good. I mean, it's not falling apart by any means, but there's just some things that are 20 years old that you just gotta start looking at sooner or later. That's all I got.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say that we were neglecting it from lack of effort or.
Like a long-term city oversight. Yeah.
So Brian, do we have any idea, we always have street projects, you know, like almost every 10 years, major street project. How much of this can be covered under some of those projects? You know what I mean? Because we've had what, 2003, 2013. I would assume we're thinking about one in obviously downtown is
23, yeah, so that's the.
But when are we gonna do residential streets? Yeah, get some of this could cover.
well, I think that's where we gotta look at the priorities based on where we think that inflow is coming from on the sewer side, maybe do some flow monitoring, look at street condition. We've got street ratings, so what we would typically do is we would look at, if we weren't worried about inflow, specific inflow sources, and you guys have a significant inflow coming from the river levels and other areas. We would look at where are your bad streets, where's your 4-inch cast iron water pipe, and then where do we think you have that clean water getting into the system, and put those 3 things together and see where are those streets and then target those.
Try to build a project out of whatever area.
Yeah.
And then this replacement of pipe versus lining, difference in years of service or not?
No, you're basically creating a plastic resin pipe inside the clay pipe in the line, so it really shouldn't be any different in years of service. You know, we learned some things on the service line project that, you know, in those cast iron services, we want to take a close look and on some of those and maybe not line those based on the experience we had.
Yeah, I'm just thinking is it better to replace some of these instead of lining them?
Well,
It sounds like, streets are in construction, it sounds like it is.
our recommendation was based on where the things overlap. The majority of this clay pipe you would be replacing. The only spots we identified for lining are the ones where you've already spent money on lining the main line pipe. You just haven't done anything with the services yet. It's a little hard in the gut to just throw that main line lining away because you already made that investment, so. But we would look at it on a case by case basis.
Well, this project, let's say whatever level we take it to, is that going to eliminate the discharge of overflow into the river?
Well, Craig, I would say there's always the potential for some storm or flood event that might cause that. But I mean, the more you can reduce clean water, groundwater, rain gutters, sump pumps, from putting clean water into the system during those high flood events or rainstorm events, the better chance you have. But I wouldn't say I've seen any city that's completely eliminated that. I mean, there's always going to be a potential rainstorm event that will cause something like that to happen. Theoretically, if you get a completely 100% watertight system, yeah, it'd be fine, but I'm not sure how realistic that is.
What year are these, what is the life of the system that you're planning to install?
Oh, you mean as far as the pipe and structures and that type of thing? I forget what ASC says, something. Here's the thing. So we can talk about what the expected life is versus what the actual life is. I'm pretty sure in 1913, when they did that cast iron water main pipe, they didn't say 120 years or whatever it was.
Right.
So I would say pipes is something like 60 years, I think, PVC pipe is what they say for useful life. So the PVC pipe systems, I think that's right.
But it'll likely get used long
Off the cuff. Going off the cuff a little bit, right? But I think that's the number they use. More than 20, I know that.
Well, the hydrologic predictions keep going up.
Yeah.
We actually tried adding on some streets to this project, thinking that, we're gonna have a crew here and we could possibly do some blacktopping at least, at the very least. And it was like, what, 2 million additional to the project? I mean, we didn't go very far and we're just kind of astonished. So I'm like, well, we know that's not gonna fly. So we got like an alley downtown in there behind the bank and a couple smaller little spots, but it was bad already. So
Infrastructure costs have gone up significantly this year. It's not out of the ordinary to hear about projects coming in 20-25% over engineers' estimate. We had that in Lanesboro. We did a project this year came in 25% over the estimate that was already attempted to be adjusted for inflation. But the interesting story about that one is it was supposed to be a $4 million total project cost. Bids came in high, turned into a $5 million project cost. At $4 million, the city's share based on grant funding versus loan funding was supposed to be 1.5 million. Came in at $5 million. The PFA had some extra grant money. They were eligible for it. The city's cost actually went down from 1.5 to 1.3 because they were in the program, they had the grant money. So there's some advantages to being in the program and being prepared and being eligible for the grant. You gotta get to that point.
Further?
Somebody else said something about like, well, how do you prevent getting to this place too? And it's like, well, so start looking at like, what could you have done doing projects, but also looking at your rates, right? In my opinion, and Michael Bonnie would tell you the same thing, there should never be a year where you're not adjusting rates. When you think about inflation, there's always inflation on costs that cities, spending on utilities. The cost of things you're not spending money on is going up. So I mean, there should really never be a year where you're not adjusting rates, at least 1 to 3%, whatever you think the cost of inflation is. Because if you had been doing that over the years, you'd have a pot of money sitting in your water fund that would be ready to help pay for some of these projects, and you'd be sitting in a better position. You wouldn't be looking at the shock of going from 17 to 55 with people. If you can gradually increase rates, it's less of a shock to people. They can plan better in their budgets and all those types of things. Because costs are going to go up, and your infrastructure is going bad. You're going to have to pay for it at some point anyway. So you're just delaying the inevitable by not doing that. So that's my soapbox.
It's good to have a dose of reality. I think, we all probably wondered, and I've had realtors tell me that our rates are high, water rates are kind of high here, and I've had citizens certainly tell me that. So just to understand where we sit compared to other cities.
Ask Mike Lubani for his comparison.
I think he's tried to give that information to us before.
You can't just look at one piece of your city.
It gets confusing, but
It is.
I can try to remember to give you that because I know that's in my email somewhere. Because I think we were looking at it in the context of property taxes as well. So, yeah.
Because the consumer pays the whole piece, the revenue piece.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Any other comments? Okay, hearing none, it looks like it's about 5:09, we'll close our public comment period. And then, as I said, we have a resolution before us. Do we have a motion to adopt a resolution?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Dean. Do you have a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Tim. Do you have any further discussion or comment from either council or utilities commission? Or staff? All right, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, thank you very much for the work that goes into this and getting our head where it needs to be and for the good questions. And we would entertain a motion to adjourn and then utilities.
I move to adjourn.